Robert Sherman had always loved the wilderness, a sanctuary where he could escape the noise of life. His father had introduced him to hunting when he was just a boy, and now, with his 10-year-old son Peter at his side, he sought to continue the tradition. The air in the upstate New York woods was cold, biting at their skin as they trudged through the underbrush. Peter, wide-eyed with excitement, clutched his new Remington Model 798 sniper rifle, though for now, Robert carried it. The forest, though beautiful, felt unusually quiet that day. As they reached their usual hunting spot, Robert decided not to climb the deer hunting tower nestled further in the woods. Something about it didn't feel right for Peter's first outing. Instead, they settled beneath the sprawling branches of an oak tree, shrouded in a heavy silence. The hours dragged on, punctuated only by Peter's yawns and sighs. Robert frowned. Hunting wasn't supposed to be exciting. He wanted to teach Peter patience, the art of waiting, but disappointment loomed like a shadow over them. Just as Robert was about to suggest they move, the crunch of leaves underfoot snapped him to attention. Instinctively, he threw an arm in front of Peter and whispered for him to ready the rifle. In the distance, behind the dense trees, a figure emerged. Someone was there, watching them. Robert's heart skipped a beat. He could barely make out a man's face, pale and half concealed by the foliage. It wasn't a hunter, no orange vest, no weapon, just a man staring at them. A wave of unease washed over him. He signaled Peter to lower the rifle, giving the stranger a brief wave, hoping to diffuse whatever tension hung between them. The man did not wave back. Instead, he stepped behind the tree, vanishing from view. Something about his face, Robert couldn't shake the image, looked off. It was as though the features didn't align, or his skin had an unnatural waxy pallor. Peter, confused, whispered, "Who was that?" Robert didn't have an answer. "Just someone who got lost, I guess," he lied, though his gut twisted in doubt. "We'll go this way." They packed up and started moving, the forest feeling suddenly claustrophobic, the trees closer than they had been before. The strange man stayed in the back of Robert's mind. Why was he out there, deep in the woods with no gear? It didn't sit right. After walking a while longer, they stopped to eat. The sandwiches provided no comfort, not with the silence pressing in on them like a living thing. Then, faint but unmistakable, footsteps again. Robert's eyes darted toward the noise. The same man was there, barely visible behind another tree, closer this time. His pale face peeked out just long enough for Robert to confirm his worst fear. It was the same man from earlier, and he was following them. A chill crept up Robert's spine as Peter, blissfully unaware of the danger, reached for his rifle. Robert grabbed the gun and whispered urgently, "Stay put." His voice trembled, betraying the fear he felt. He stood, walking towards the man, every step heavy with dread. The closer he got, the more he realized this was no ordinary man. His head seemed wrong, too round, too smooth, as if it were detached from a body. Robert stopped. A dreadful realization blew me in his mind. He turned on his heel, telling Peter it was time to leave, quickly. They made their way through the forest, picking up the pace but not daring to run. The hair on the back of Robert's neck prickled as he imagined the man's eyes boring into his back. A snap behind them. Robert's pulse spiked, and he turned around in a frenzy. The man was there again, but this time, he was holding something. Robert couldn't make it out fully, but there was a glint in his hand, like metal catching the last rays of daylight. Anger and fear intertwined, and Robert had enough. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. He advanced, the rifle heavy in his hands, finger twitching near the trigger. The man retreated behind the tree, but then thud. A sickening sound of something hitting the ground. Robert crept forward, heart hammering in his chest, his legs almost refusing to carry him. He reached the tree and slowly peered around it, his breath catching in his throat. On the ground lay a head. Just a head, with no body attached. The skin pale and waxy, eyes frozen wide in a grotesque expression of fear. Robert stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror before him. Without thinking, he turned and sprinted back to Peter. "Run!" he yelled, and together they bolted through the forest, not stopping until they reached the safety of their truck. At night, sleep didn't come for Robert. Every creak, every rustle outside sent his nerves into overdrive. When his wife mentioned the recent disappearance of 2 local hunters, Robert's blood ran cold. He knew, deep down, that what he had seen wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something was out there in those woods, something that didn't belong. Even now, when Robert takes Peter hunting, a part of him remains on edge, always listening for the sound of footsteps behind them, for the pale face watching from the shadows. And he wonders, what was that man, or whatever it was, really hunting that day? Maria had always been a rational person. She scoffed at ghost stories and dismissed supernatural events as mere figments of imagination. But that was before the Black Wolf entered her life. She never believed in monsters lurking in the shadows until she encountered one. It started with 3 rapid taps on her window. Maria was half asleep and she initially thought it was the wind. She turned off her light and used her phone's flashlight to navigate to the window, expecting to see a branch tapping against the glass. But outside, there was only darkness. She saw nothing, and a chill ran down her spine as she crawled back under her covers. Tap, tap, tape. The sound came again, louder this time. Maria pulled the covers over her head, squeezing her eyes shut and praying the noise would stop. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic thumping almost drowning out the persistent tapping. As she was about to drift off, it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes shot open and her pulse quickened. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was tapping on her window. She plugged in her headphones, turned up the music, and tried to ignore the sound. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. Bang, bang, bang. The aggressive banging at her window jolted Maria awake. She glanced at her alarm clock, 3:26 a.m. She was sweating, and her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Shakily, she wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and left her room, seeking refuge in the living room. She lay down on the couch, trying to calm herself. Then she heard it, a low, deep howl that seemed to last forever. It echoed in her mind long after it stopped. She peeked through the window behind the couch and saw it, the biggest wolf she had ever seen. Its pitch-black fur looked almost like a shadow come to life, and its golden eyes seemed to pierce her soul. The wolf's gaze held her captive. It felt as though the creature was clawing at her mind, trying to break through her skull and feast on her sanity. Suddenly, clouds covered the moon, plunging the backyard into darkness. When the moonlight returned, the wolf had vanished, leaving Maria shaken and terrified. The next morning, Maria asked her mother if she had heard any howling during the night. Her mother looked at her with concern and replied, "No, sweetie. I didn't hear anything. I slept like a baby." The day proceeded normally, with school passing in a blur. That night, the howling returned. It seemed to go on for hours, and Maria struggled to sleep. The following day, she found a sketch of the black wolf on a blank page of her biology journal. She knew she hadn't drawn it, and neither her friends nor her parents could have done it. The realization that the creature had somehow entered her room filled her with dread. During lunch at school, Maria told her friends about the strange occurrences. As she unwrapped her sandwich, she took a bite and immediately felt something squirmy in her mouth. She spat out the contents and looked at her sandwich. Inside was raw, rotten meat crawling with maggots. Horrified, she ran to the trash can and vomited. In the restroom, she cried uncontrollably, washing her mouth out repeatedly. The assistant principal found her and led her to her office, trying to understand what had happened. Maria couldn't explain it. The realization that the black wolf was tormenting her, even at school, was too much to bear. The torment Maria's days turned into a living nightmare. Every night, the tapping and banging on her window kept her awake. She felt watched, followed. Strange symbols appeared on her window, drawn in what looked like blood. Another drawing of the black wolf appeared in her journal. The constant fear and sleep deprivation began to take their toll. One morning, a package arrived with her name on it, but no return address. Inside was a note to Maria B. Enjoy, Little Pig. The signature read, "The Black Wolf." Trembling, Maria opened the trash bag inside the box and found a decaying pig's head. The stench was overwhelming, and she threw the box out of her window, sobbing in terror. Maria's parents were out of town, leaving her alone. That night, she heard 3 subtle knocks at the door. As she reached for the doorknob, the knocks became aggressive. Little pig, let me in," a voice taunted. Frozen in fear, Maria backed away. The door burst open and a shadowy figure lunged at her. The intruder dragged Maria to the basement, binding her to a chair. When the light flickered on, she saw him, a man wearing a black leather mask in the shape of a wolf's face. His eyes were black, with glowing golden irises, just like the wolf's. He wore black military gloves, a tight-fitting hoodie, and black jeans. "Little pig, are you scared of me?" "The big bad wolf," he growled. Maria whimpered, unable to respond. He snapped her fingers one by one, reciting a twisted version of the nursery rhyme. The pain was excruciating, and her muffled screams filled the basement. The man ranted about how Maria had humiliated him in high school, showing the class his research journal and making him a laughingstock. His anger and resentment had festered over the years, transforming him into the Black Wolf. Now, he was taking his revenge. In a desperate bid for survival, Maria kicked out at the man, momentarily stunning him. She managed to free herself from the chair and ran upstairs. She called her parents, who rushed home and contacted the police. When they arrived, they found no evidence of the intruder. Maria's injuries were dismissed as self-inflicted, and she was taken to a psychiatric facility. Inside the facility, Maria felt trapped and hopeless. She knew the Black Wolf was still out there watching her. One foggy night, as she stared out of the window, she saw a message written in the condensation. "The girl who cried wolf." Years passed, and Maria was released from the facility. She moved to a new city, changed her name, and tried to rebuild her life. But the memories of the Black Wolf haunted her. She started investigating similar cases and discovered a pattern: young women tormented by a shadowy figure, all connected to a mysterious man who called himself the Black Wolf. Determined to stop him, Maria began her hunt. She tracked down survivors and pieced together the Black Wolf's movements. Each encounter was more horrifying than the last. The survivors spoke of his cruelty, his sadistic games, and the fear that he would return. Maria's search led her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, she found a shrine dedicated to the Black Wolf, filled with drawings, symbols, and the decaying heads of animals. The air was thick with the stench of death. Suddenly, the Black Wolf appeared, stepping out of the shadows. "Little pig, you've come back to me," he sneered. Maria felt a surge of fear, but also a burning resolve. She had faced her nightmare once and survived. Now she would end it. A brutal struggle ensued. Maria fought with everything she had, using the skills she had learned during her years of preparation. The Black Wolf was strong, but Maria's determination was stronger. She managed to disarm him and pin him to the ground. As the police arrived, the Black Wolf laughed. "You may have caught me, but you'll never escape me," he taunted. Maria knew he was right. The trauma he had inflicted would always be a part of her. But she also knew she had won. She had faced her monster and survived. Maria's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind seemingly ordinary faces. She continued to advocate for victims of stalking and abuse, using her experience to help others. The Black Wolf was imprisoned, but his legacy of terror lived on in the nightmares of those he had tormented. Maria had learned to live with her fear, to use it as a source of strength. She knew that monsters were real, but so were heroes. And sometimes, the greatest hero was the one who faced the darkness and refused to let it win. The castle in the woods. It had been a long and exhausting day, making sleep come easily. But when the dream began, there was no peace to be found. It was a cold, lifeless night. I stood in front of an enormous ancient castle deep in the woods. The world around me was swallowed by darkness. Only the faintest touch of blue in the sky gave any hint of light. An unholy, gut-wrenching sound echoed from within the castle walls. A demonic, hellish voice calling me, whispering unspeakable things into my mind. Though the voice seemed distant, it resonated with such unnatural clarity that I knew it came from inside the castle. I had no control over my body. I was drawn toward the massive structure. The castle had no doors, only empty, yawning corridors that led me further into its cold embrace. The walls grew tighter as I pressed through, scraping against jagged stone, my breath shallow with dread. The voice grew louder, more piercing, its words now distorted and maddening. I reached a door on my left. Trembling, I entered a room shrouded in absolute darkness. The voice was everywhere now, filling my head with its horrifying chant. I stumbled, crashing into something solid, and then I awoke, drenched in sweat. I was standing over my 4-year-old son's bed, his wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at me in terror. He had been screaming from his own nightmare, but it was my silent, looming figure that had scared him most. He described how I had entered his room, stood over him, and bent down as if to whisper something in his ear. But I couldn't remember doing any of it. The haunted portrait. Joey Manuso, an atheist by nature and a skeptic of anything supernatural, shared an unsettling story that still makes him question reality. It was Halloween night, and he and his friends were out trick-or-treating. They reached a house at the end of a long, winding road, its windows flickering with faint blue light. As Joey entered, his friends seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving him alone in the eerie, dimly lit room. He was now upstairs, though he didn't recall climbing the stairs. A massive portrait dominated the wall before him. His 30-year-old cousin, a woman he hadn't seen in years, stared down at him. Her eyes were unnaturally large, almost bulging, and they followed his every movement. He couldn't look away. Suddenly, the painting cracked with a deafening screech, and the frame began to fall, tumbling toward him with terrifying speed. Joey couldn't move, his body frozen in fear. Just as the portrait was about to crush him, he jolted awake, heart pounding. Minutes later, his phone rang. It was his uncle calling to deliver terrible news. His cousin had just died of a heroin overdose. The details of the dream and the uncanny timing still haunt Joey to this day. The Red Room. I was curled up with a newspaper when everything went dark. I jerked awake, or at least I thought I did. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of a flashlight in my hand. In the back of my mind, I knew I had to check the basement. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended, flashlight beam flickering in and out. Inside the fuse box, a cryptic message on a sticky note read, "Go to the Red Room." My house had no Red Room, yet something told me I had no choice. As I climbed the stairs back up, an unsettling moan rose from the boiler room, filling the air with a primal, suffocating dread. I sprinted up to the second floor, where an ominous red glow seeped from beneath a door I had never seen before. The chanting began as I reached the door. 314. 314. Repeating with growing intensity. The door swung open, revealing a solitary chair facing a crimson wall. The glow seemed to pulse, and the chant was now in my ear, inside my skull. I woke with a gasp, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone. 3:14 a.m., the exact time from the dream. The figure at the window. It was a summer night in 2015. I was high, coming down from a party, and crashed into bed. I've heard people say getting high can mess with your dreams, make them more vivid, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The dream began in a forest, dark and silent. But the silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. There were no natural sounds, only ghostly whispers and footsteps trailing behind me. No matter how fast I ran, the footsteps never got closer, yet they never faded. I came upon an old house in the woods and bolted inside, barricading the door. The house was barren, a black and white world, devoid of life. Then the knocking began. At first it was subtle, tap, 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 but it grew relentless. I glanced at the window, and there it was, a shadowy figure staring at me, unblinking, its hand knocking with mechanical precision. I woke up in a panic, but the knocking didn't stop. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and looked toward the window. Someone was out there. I screamed for my dad, and the figure bolted into the night. We searched, but found no one. My dad told me it was just a dream. I still don't believe him. Visitors to Castringham Hall in Suffolk will find it almost unchanged from the days when our story took place. The beautiful old house stands with its gardens and lake, an image of serene elegance. However, one significant detail is missing. The towering ash tree that once stood proudly in front of the house, its branches almost touching the walls. Our tale begins in 1690 with a peculiar and solitary woman named Mrs. Mothersole. She lived in a small, dilapidated cottage on the outskirts of the village, a place where the light of the moon cast eerie shadows on the overgrown garden. Known for her eccentric behavior and whispered to possess dark powers, she was shunned and feared by the villagers. Sir Matthew Fell, the owner of Castringham Hall at that time, was a rational man, not given to superstition. However, even he could not ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to follow Mrs. Mothersole. He had witnessed her on nights of the full moon, climbing the ash tree outside his bedroom. She carried a peculiar knife, muttering to herself as she cut pieces from the tree. Once, driven by curiosity and a sense of duty to his estate, Sir Matthew followed her home. He saw her disappear into her cottage, only to find her answering the door moments later, dressed in her night clothes and feigning sleepiness. The villagers, already suspicious of her, were convinced of her witchcraft. They brought her to trial, and despite her vehement denials and protests, she was found guilty and sentenced to hang. On the day of her execution, Mrs. Mothersole was defiant, her eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. As the noose tightened around her neck, she uttered a chilling curse. "There will be guests at the hall." Her words hung in the air, filled with an ominous promise. After her death, Sir Matthew was plagued by a sense of guilt and unease. He confided in his friend, the local vicar, who reassured him that he had done the right thing. She was a dangerous woman, Sir Matthew, the vicar said, and her influence would have only brought harm. That evening, as Sir Matthew and the vicar strolled through the gardens under the light of the full moon, Sir Matthew noticed something unusual. "What kind of animal is that running down the ash tree? It looks very strange," he remarked, pointing to a shadowy figure scuttling down the trunk. The vicar saw it too, but only for a fleeting moment. The creature appeared to have more than 4 legs, an unnatural sight that made the vicar shake his head in disbelief. "I must be tired," he thought, dismissing the vision as a trick of the light. He bid Sir Matthew good night and left. The following morning, Sir Matthew's servants were alarmed when he did not appear at his usual time. As hours passed without any sign of him, their worry grew. They ventured to his bedroom, finding the door locked. After knocking repeatedly and receiving no response, they broke it down. Inside, they found Sir Matthew's lifeless body on the bed. His skin was completely black, a sight that filled them with horror. There were no wounds or signs of struggle, and the room was undisturbed, except for the wide-open window. Initially, they suspected poison, but the doctor found no trace of it and was baffled by the cause of death. The vicar, upon hearing the tragic news, rushed to Castringham Hall. While waiting for the doctor's verdict, he noticed Sir Matthew's Bible on the bedside table. He opened it, and his eyes fell on the words from the book of Luke, chapter 8, "Cut it down." The message seemed eerily significant. Sir Matthew's room was locked that day and remained sealed for the next 40 years. By then, his grandson, Sir Richard Fell, had taken up residence at Castringham Hall. Unlike his grandfather, Sir Richard was a man of indulgence, keen on renovating the hall and expanding the local church to create a grand family seat. During the renovations, several graves in the churchyard needed to be moved, including that of Mrs. Mothersole. The villagers gathered, eager to witness the exhumation of the witch's grave. To their astonishment, they found it empty, no body, no bones, only an eerie void. Around this time, Sir Richard began to suffer from restless nights. The wind seemed to howl through the corridors, his fire would smoke, and the curtains rustled even when there was no breeze. His room, facing east, allowed the morning sun to wake him too early. Frustrated, he decided to find a more suitable room. As he explored the hall, he dismissed each room for one reason or another until he stood before his grandfather's old room. Despite his servants' warnings about the room's dark history and the unlucky ash tree outside, Sir Richard was determined. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. "See? Nothing unusual here, James," he declared, opening the window. The ash tree's branches loomed ominously, almost as if they were reaching into the room, but he shrugged off any sense of unease. At that moment, a visitor arrived, a man named William Crone, the grandson of the vicar from Sir Matthew's time. He came bearing old papers and documents related to the hall's history. As they shared a drink in the library, Sir Richard perused the documents, finding notes about his grandfather's mysterious death. Well, Sir Richard mused with a chuckle. "It seems my grandfather's Bible offered advice on the day he died. Cut it down." The vicar thought it referred to that old ash tree. Perhaps it did. Intrigued, William asked to see the Bible. Sir Richard fetched it, blowing off the dust. "Let's see what advice it gives me," he said, opening it at random. His eyes fell on the words, "You shall look for me in the morning, and I shall not be here." Sir Richard, convinced the message again referred to the ash tree, ordered his servants to cut it down the next day. However, that night, just as the clock struck midnight, a strange and terrible creature leaped from his bed, scurrying to the window and disappearing into the tree's shadows. No one saw it, but the next morning, Sir Richard was found dead, his body blackened like his grandfather's. William Crome, recalling the Bible's warning, rushed to Castringham Hall. The family and servants were gathered around the ash tree, whispering about its strange nature. James, the servant, revealed that the tree was hollow and something seemed to live inside it. The gardener, climbing a ladder to inspect the tree, recoiled in terror and dropped his lamp, setting the tree on fire. As the flames consumed the ash tree, monstrous, spider-like creatures emerged, each one as large as a human head and covered in grey hair. The crowd watched in horror as the creatures fled the inferno, only to be beaten to death by the terrified onlookers. When the fire finally died down, William, James, and a few brave souls examined the hollow tree's remains. Inside, they discovered the skeletal remains of a human, identified by the doctors as a woman who had died around 1690, the year Mrs. Mothersole was hanged. Castringham Hall never fully recovered from the horrors associated with the ash tree. The tale of the witch's curse and the ghastly creatures that dwelled in the tree became a legend, whispered by villagers and visitors alike. And although the ash tree is long gone, the shadow of its dark history still lingers over the old house and its gardens, a reminder of the supernatural events that once took place there. It was just a typical afternoon when Amanda scrolled through Craigslist, searching for a new place to live. She had just turned 24 and was ready to take that next step toward independence. Her boyfriend, whom she'd been dating for a few months, wasn't quite ready for the move-in talk, so she decided to find a roommate instead. Amanda was cautious by nature, but the ad she found was too good to pass up. Amanda arrived at the house just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, and the house itself looked slightly unkempt, with tall grass swaying in the evening breeze and windows coated in a layer of dust. A handwritten note taped to the front door read, "Door broken, use back door." This was Amanda's first red flag, but she brushed it aside, attributing the sign to an unfortunate accident. As she walked around to the back of the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence, a sense of unease began to creep up her spine. The back door creaked open before she could even knock, revealing a man in his 40s. His appearance was disheveled, greasy hair, wrinkled clothes, and an unshaven face. He introduced himself as the landlord, explaining that the occupant was working late and had asked him to show her around. Amanda's intuition began to stir, but she forced a smile and followed the man inside. The interior of the house was eerily empty, no furniture, no decorations, just bare walls and dusty floors. The landlord kept the tour brisk, flipping light switches on and off quickly, barely allowing Amanda more than a glance at each room. When they reached the front of the house, Amanda noticed a plank nailed across the front door, confirming the earlier note. The man dismissed it with a vague explanation about ongoing repairs, but Amanda's discomfort deepened. Then came the final room, the occupant's bedroom, or so the landlord claimed. He refused to let her inside, citing privacy concerns, which at first seemed reasonable. But Amanda's heart began to race when she noticed the door was locked from the outside. Just as Amanda was about to voice her doubts, the landlord insisted on showing her the basement. He described it as recently furnished, a perfect spot for a recreation room. The door to the basement was at the end of a narrow hallway, and as the landlord opened it, the door swung inward, creating a barrier between Amanda and the back exit. The basement was a yawning black hole, and the man's eerie smile as he gestured for her to go first sent chills down Amanda's spine. Her heart pounded as she stared into the darkness, feeling trapped and vulnerable. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with a text message. Seizing the opportunity, Amanda pretended it was a call from a friend who had just arrived. She forced a laugh, saying she needed to let her friend in, and quickly slipped past the landlord, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. Once outside, Amanda sprinted to her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She fumbled with her keys, finally getting the door open and speeding away, her pulse thundering in her ears. Amanda's hands were still shaking as she recounted the ordeal to her family. They immediately called the police, who launched an investigation into the house. What they found was more horrifying than Amanda could have imagined. The house had been foreclosed 6 months earlier, abandoned and left to decay. The room the landlord refused to show Amanda was filled with dirty blankets, half-eaten food, and walls covered in obscene magazine clippings. It was clear that the man had been squatting there, but that wasn't the worst of it. The basement, where the man had tried to lead Amanda, held a gruesome surprise. A thin fishing line was tied at shin level across the stairs, almost invisible in the dark. Just beyond it, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts was rigged to swing at head height, a brutal trap designed to incapacitate anyone who descended the stairs. Haunted by her near escape, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Weeks passed, and she found herself unable to sleep, her dreams plagued by the image of the landlord's sinister smile. Despite the warnings of her family and friends, she felt compelled to return to the house one last time. In the dead of night, Amanda drove back to the house, parking a block away and approaching on foot. The neighborhood was as silent as before, the house looming in the darkness like a forgotten relic. The back door was slightly ajar, just as she had left it. With trembling hands, Amanda pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was unchanged, still empty, still cold. She crept through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence, until she reached the basement door. Her heart pounded as she stared into the pitch-black void below. This time she was prepared. She had brought a flashlight and a kitchen knife, gripping them both tightly as she descended the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the fishing line and the broom handle trap. But as Amanda reached the bottom step, her flashlight flickered and a faint rustling sound came from the far corner of the basement. She froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the shadows. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the flashlight flickered again, then went out, plunging her into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, raspy voice whispered her name from the blackness. Amanda's story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath seemingly innocent ads. What began as a hopeful search for independence nearly ended in tragedy, a stark warning to always trust your instincts and exercise caution when dealing with strangers. Emily, a 22-year-old college student, finds a cheap couch on Craigslist. The seller, Bob, insists on delivering it, but she decides to pick it up herself. At Bob's rundown house, she discovers the couch is in poor condition, and Bob makes an inappropriate offer. She leaves, but that night, someone tries to break into her home. Emily believes it's Bob and calls the police. After receiving a threatening note, Emily installs security cameras. Bob eventually breaks in, but the police arrest him. Despite his arrest, Emily remains fearful and moves to a new apartment. Months later, Bob finds her again and confronts her, but the police arrest him for stalking. Emily continues to live cautiously, but refuses to let fear control her life. Emily, a 22-year-old college student, was excited to move into her new apartment. The place was small but cozy, just perfect for her. However, it was missing a key element, a couch. She spent hours scrolling through Craigslist listings, looking for something that would fit her budget and style. Most of the options were either too expensive or in terrible condition. Late one evening, after a long day of unpacking and arranging her things, Emily stumbled upon a listing that caught her eye. The couch in the pictures looked almost brand new, with a modern design that would fit perfectly in her living room. The price was incredibly low, almost suspiciously so. But desperation and excitement overruled her caution. Emily clicked on the ad and started typing an email to the seller. The email address seemed strange, a jumble of letters and numbers that didn't form any recognizable name. Despite this, she sent her offer and waited. Surprisingly, the response came within 5 minutes. "Hi Emily, I accept your offer. Can you send me your address so I can deliver the couch to you?" Emily hesitated. She didn't want a stranger knowing her address, especially someone she had only interacted with online. She suggested picking up the couch from his place instead, but the man insisted on delivering it himself. The back and forth continued for several emails, each one increasing Emily's discomfort. Eventually, she stopped responding. The next day, another email from the seller arrived. This time, he provided his address and asked her to come over at her earliest convenience. The price was so low, and the couch looked so good that Emily decided to give it a shot. She reasoned that if she felt uncomfortable when she arrived, she could always leave. On a cloudy Saturday afternoon, Emily got into her van and drove to the address the seller had given her. The further she drove, the more rural the area became. Trees lined the narrow roads, and houses were few and far between. Her GPS directed her to turn onto a dirt road, and she followed its instructions until she reached a small, run-down house. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she parked her van. The house looked much worse than the others on the block, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. She considered turning back, but she had driven so far already. Gathering her courage, she walked up to the front door and rang the bell. The door creaked open, and a middle-aged man wearing a big baseball cap greeted her with a wide, unsettling smile. His eyes didn't match the smile, giving Emily an uneasy feeling. He introduced himself as Bob and invited her in. The inside of the house was dimly lit and smelled musty. Bob led her to the living room where the couch was situated. Emily's heart sank. The couch was in far worse condition than it appeared in the photos. There were scuff marks, small tears, and a general sense of neglect. She pointed out the discrepancies, and Bob's smile never wavered. Instead, he offered to lower the price. Emily declined, stating she wasn't interested anymore. As she turned to leave, Bob placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll give it to you for free if you can give me something in return," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Emily's stomach churned with disgust and fear. She shrugged off his hand and bolted out of the house, not looking back as she jumped into her van and sped away. That night, Emily tried to shake off the encounter. She was safe at home, and she convinced herself that Bob was just a creepy, lonely man. As she lay in bed watching TV, she thought she heard footsteps on her porch. Mute. Listen. The distinct sound of someone fiddling with her front doorknob sent her heart racing. She tiptoed to the front door and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. Then she heard the sound of the gate to her backyard creaking open. Panic set in. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking. As she spoke to the dispatcher, the noise moved to her back door. She shouted that the police were on their way, hoping to scare off whoever was there. The sound stopped, followed by the gate closing again. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. They took her statement and promised to patrol the area more frequently. Since that night, Emily lived in a constant state of fear. Every little noise startled her, and she had trouble sleeping. She was convinced that Bob had followed her home. She even considered moving to a new apartment, but her finances were tight. Her friends and family tried to reassure her, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave her. She started having nightmares about Bob breaking into her house, his creepy smile haunting her dreams. She often woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. Weeks passed, and Emily's fear only grew. One evening, she came home to find a note taped to her front door. It read, "I know where you live. See you soon." Her blood ran cold. She called the police again, but there was little they could do without more evidence. She started noticing small things out of place around her apartment. A window that she was sure she had closed was slightly ajar. Her mail was tampered with. She felt like she was being watched all the time. Emily decided to install security cameras around her property. She hoped that if Bob came back, she would have proof to give to the police. One stormy night, Emily was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She could hear footsteps inside her house, moving closer to her bedroom. She locked the door and hid in the closet, trying to control her breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside her bedroom door. She could hear the doorknob turning slowly. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to the dispatcher, begging for the police to hurry. The door burst open and she could hear Bob's voice. "Emily, where are you?" "I just want to talk." She stifled a sob as the footsteps drew closer to the closet. Just as the door was about to open, she heard the sound of sirens outside. Bob cursed and ran out of the room. She stayed hidden until she heard the police shouting, followed by the sound of a struggle. The police arrested Bob, who was carrying a knife and various tools for breaking and entering. Emily was shaken but relieved that he was finally caught. She gave her statement to the officers and watched as they took Bob away. In the following weeks, Emily tried to regain some sense of normalcy. The nightmares persisted, but she felt a little safer knowing Bob was behind bars. She installed even more security measures around her home and started attending therapy to help deal with the trauma. Emily eventually moved to a new apartment in a different part of town. She couldn't shake the fear completely, but she was determined not to let it control her life. She continued her therapy and slowly started to feel more like herself. She never used Craigslist again, opting for more reputable sources for her purchases. Her friends and family remained supportive, helping her through the difficult times. Months passed, and Emily started to feel a sense of normalcy returning to her life. One evening, she was out with friends when she received a call from an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered it. "Emily, it's Bob. Did you miss me?" Her heart stopped. She hung up and immediately called the police. They assured her that Bob was still in custody, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had found a way to reach her. She changed her phone number and took extra precautions, but the fear never fully went away. She often felt like she was being watched, and her nightmares returned with a vengeance. One fateful night, Emily was returning home late when she noticed a figure lurking near her apartment. Panic set in as she fumbled for her keys. The figure stepped into the light, revealing Bob's unmistakable grin. "Hello, Emily. Did you think you could get away from me?" She screamed and ran towards her apartment. She could hear Bob's footsteps behind her, getting closer. She made it inside and slammed the door, locking it just as Bob reached it. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Bob pounded on the door, shouting obscenities and threats. Emily retreated to her bedroom, clutching a baseball bat for protection. The police arrived quickly and arrested Bob once again. This time, he was charged with stalking and violating a restraining order. With Bob back in custody, Emily felt a sense of relief, but the trauma lingered. She continued her therapy and leaned on her support system more than ever. She took self-defense classes and made sure her new apartment was as secure as possible. Emily knew she would never be the same, but she refused to let fear control her life. She shared her story with others. The night was suffocatingly still as Mark drove down the foggy dirt road in his black Jeep, the tires spinning and sputtering over the uneven, rain-soaked terrain. The thick fog swirled around him, swallowing the headlights in its impenetrable depths. The road ahead was nothing more than a narrow, shifting ribbon of dirt. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes darting between the stretch of road ahead and the foreboding forest lining either side. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of his engine and the occasional scrape of branches against the vehicle's metal frame. Mark was on his way to his aunt's secluded cabin deep within the Gunnison National Forest, a place isolated from even the faintest hint of civilization. She had called earlier, her voice trembling, sounding frantic, but the connection had abruptly cut off before she could explain her distress. The urgency in her tone had compelled him to leave immediately, throwing a bottle of water into the passenger seat and gunning it through the night. That was 2 hours ago. As he checked the gas gauge, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty, the light blinking ominously. The road had become increasingly unfamiliar, the grassy overgrowth starting to claim the path. He glanced around, recognizing nothing, and for the first time he felt truly lost. Even the stream that had once run parallel to the road had disappeared, leaving him surrounded by trees, tall, ancient sentinels that seemed to close in around him. A glow flickered in the corner of his eye. Mark jerked his head to the right, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching out from the darkness. He chuckled nervously, his father's mocking words echoing in his mind. "God will show you the way. Follow his light, and you'll find your path." "Yeah, right," Mark muttered under his breath, his lips curling in disdain. The last thing he needed now was his father's sermons haunting him too. Just as he began to regain his focus, the car sputtered and came to a shuddering halt. The gas had run dry. Mark slammed his fists against the steering wheel, his breath fogging up the cold windshield. "Perfect," he muttered to himself, his frustration barely masking the creeping unease. Grabbing his phone, he activated the flashlight and stepped out into the biting cold. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. His breath puffed out in thick clouds as he hugged his jacket tighter around him. He tried to shrug off the chill, but it wasn't just the cold, it was the feeling of being watched. Mark turned to retrieve the gas canister from the trunk, only to realize it was missing. In a burst of frustration, he kicked the tire, instantly regretting it as pain shot through his foot. "Damn it." He cursed into the empty night, the sound echoing through the trees, swallowed by the fog. A shadow darted past him, barely perceptible but enough to make his heart skip a beat. Startled, Mark stumbled back, losing his balance and crashing against the car. Glass shattered as his elbow hit the window, sending sharp pain coursing up his arm. Warm blood trickled down his skin, pooling at his fingertips. He pressed his hand against the wound, the blood slipping through his fingers, fast and relentless. His vision blurred, dizziness overtaking him as he struggled to stay conscious. He collapsed onto the ground, his body limp, the cold earth pulling him into its grasp. The last thing he saw before everything faded to black was that fleeting glow again, dancing in the darkness, taunting him. Mark awoke with a start, his face covered in dirt. His entire body ached, especially his arm, the blood-soaked shirt doing little to stem the flow. He winced as he unwrapped the makeshift bandage, the blood oozing from the deep gash in rhythm with his heartbeat. Panic rose in his chest as he realized just how dire his situation was. He grabbed his phone from the dirt and tried to call for help, but the screen flashed the same message, no service. The silence around him felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, a low rustling sound came from the bushes. Mark's pulse quickened as he scanned the area with his flashlight, but he saw nothing. The eerie glow he'd noticed before was gone, leaving only the dense, suffocating darkness. Driven by desperation, Mark forced himself to his feet, blood seeping from his wound with each step. He moved forward, hoping that his aunt's cabin was close. But every step felt like an eternity, the trees twisting and bending in the fog, forming grotesque shapes in the night. The ground beneath him felt wrong, soft, almost like it was shifting under his weight. Suddenly, his foot caught on something solid, sending him tumbling forward. As he fell, his phone skidded away from him, the light flickering as it landed in the mud. Gritting his teeth through the pain, Mark reached for the phone and shone the light on what he had tripped over. His breath caught in his throat. A skull, half buried in the dirt, its hollow eyes staring blankly into the night. Mark scrambled backward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the scene. Who had died out here? How long had this skull been hidden beneath the forest floor? And who, or what, was responsible? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound that sent chills down his spine, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Help us." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the sound. There in the fog he saw them, ghostly figures, barely visible but undeniably real. They moved slowly, their translucent forms glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Please, let us rest." Mark stumbled backward, his mind reeling. His vision blurred, and the voices grew louder, more insistent. He tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. The ghosts surrounded him, their mournful cries filling his ears. Just as he thought he would collapse again, a bright light pierced the fog. He looked up and saw a cabin in the distance, its windows glowing warmly in the cold night. His aunt's house. With the last of his strength, Mark pushed himself forward, his legs trembling as he stumbled toward the light. The ghosts lingered at the edge of the clearing, their eyes watching him silently. When Mark finally reached the porch, his aunt was waiting for him. She pulled him inside, her eyes filled with concern. "Mark, what happened to you?" Mark shook his head, unable to find the words. All he could think about were the spirits, their cries for help echoing in his mind. As his aunt patched up his wounds, Mark glanced out the window. In the distance, he could still see them, the restless dead, trapped in the forest, waiting for someone to free them. David had always enjoyed a good prank, especially when it came to tormenting his friends. But this time, things had spiraled out of control. He stood by Brett's pickup truck in the vast emptiness of Mount McKinley National Forest, the scent of pine trees and damp earth surrounding him. Nature had never been his thing. He despised hiking and couldn't tell poison oak from a maple leaf. Yet here he was, unloading gear for what was supposed to be a fun camping trip with Ryan, Eric, and Emily. As he dropped the last of the supplies into the clearing, David felt a sense of unease. The road they had driven down seemed to disappear into the thick forest, swallowed by the trees. His pulse quickened as he realized how isolated they truly were. Still, he shrugged it off, chalking it up to his distaste for the outdoors. Ryan, Eric, and Emily were off gathering kindling and setting up camp facilities. His only job was to pitch the tents, an activity he loathed almost as much as hiking. Emily's tent, a hideous hot pink monstrosity, lay scattered before him. Her reassurance that it would be easy to set up now seemed like a cruel joke. Spikes, ropes, and tarps were strewn everywhere, and with no cell signal, there was no way to look up a tutorial. Cursing under his breath, David began the frustrating task of piecing it together. The sound of rustling leaves caught his attention. He paused, staring into the dense forest. He could have sworn he saw movement, something watching him from the shadows. His skin crawled, and for a moment, he thought of every horror movie where the idiot who investigates the noise is the first to die. Refusing to be that guy, David backed away from the trees, locking himself in Ryan's truck. Staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he berated himself for being paranoid. The others would return and mock him for his cowardice, especially Emily. After all, this trip was partly a result of him making fun of her mechanical skills. She had challenged him to prove he could survive a week in the wilderness, and here he was, struggling with something as simple as a tent. Taking a deep breath, David stepped out of the truck, determined to prove them all wrong. He finished setting up the tents just as the others returned. Eric arrived first, dripping wet and grinning like a madman, having taken a dip in the nearby lake after digging a latrine. Ryan and Emily followed, hauling logs and kindling, their faces flushed with exhaustion. David tried to suppress the growing sense of dread gnawing at him, but it was hard to shake. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, sharing drinks and swapping ghost stories. Eric produced a bottle of moonshine, and soon, the group was laughing and daring each other to reveal their greatest fears. When it was David's turn, he blurted out the first thing that came to mind: feathers. His friends erupted into laughter, all except Emily. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing as if she had just been given a personal challenge. Smiling wickedly, Emily launched into a dark tale about a boy named Timmy Clover who lived on a farm. As the harvest moon approached, the animals grew restless, and one day, Timmy discovered something horrible in the chicken coop, a massive chicken, bloodthirsty and violent, that attacked him. Days later, Timmy began to transform, sprouting feathers from his skin, his body warping into something monstrous. In the end, Timmy climbed to the roof of his house and leaped, believing he could fly. But instead, he plummeted to his death, leaving only a trail of feathers behind. David shuddered as she finished her story with a morbid nursery rhyme, but he laughed it off with the others. Still, the campfire warmth did little to chase away the chill creeping into his bones. Hours later, David woke to the fire extinguished, a cold breeze licking at his face. His throat was parched, and as he reached for his pack, he realized something horrifying. Everything was gone. The tents, the truck, his friends, vanished into the night. He called out, but no one answered. Panic surged through him, and he began to stumble through the trees, the weight of his fear pressing down on him like a vice. Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared through the woods. Relief washed over him as Ryan's truck pulled back into the clearing. His friends tumbled out, laughing, covered in dirt. They had gone on a hike, leaving behind a note in his sleeping bag explaining their absence. David's anger flared, but he forced a smile, knowing they'd mock him for panicking. However, the eerie feeling that had settled in his gut wouldn't leave. The next day, the itching began. David couldn't stop scratching at his arms, his legs, his neck. At first, he joked about it, saying maybe he was turning into Timmy Clover, but the laughter from his friends felt distant, hollow. By the time they reached a steep cliff they planned to climb, the itching had become unbearable. Emily, as usual, teased him relentlessly about his fear of feathers and being alone. But her taunts didn't cut as deep as they usually did. Something darker had taken root in David's mind. As they scaled the cliff, David's irritation grew with each taunt. His hands trembled, not from the height, but from the anger boiling inside him. The moment came when he could take it no more. Gripping a loose rock, David pried it from the wall and, with a flick of his wrist, sent it plummeting down. It struck Emily squarely on the head. Her body went limp, hanging motionless on the rope. The laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by a sickening silence. Ryan and Eric froze, staring down at her crumpled form. "We need to get help," Eric stammered, his voice trembling. David, still gripping the cliff, smiled. "She'll be fine," he muttered, more to himself than to them. Before Ryan could react, David shoved him. The suddenness of it sent Ryan tumbling backward, his scream echoing as he disappeared over the edge. Eric, panicked, tried to grab hold of the rope, but it snapped, sending him crashing into the abyss below. David stood alone at the top of the cliff, his skin crawling with an itch that wouldn't stop. He looked down at the bodies of his friends, broken and twisted on the rocks below, and for the first time, he felt at peace. The constant taunting, the fear, the weight of his ego, all of it had fallen away with them. In the end, the prank that had started so harmlessly had become a death sentence. Weeks later, when searchers found their bodies, they discovered a camera in Ryan's truck. The footage revealed Emily and the others laughing as they glued feathers to David's arms while he slept, not realizing the glue would cause him to scratch his skin raw. Though the deaths were ruled accidental, some say the forest still whispers their names. And if you listen closely on a cold night, you might hear Emily's voice, singing softly as her ghost dangles from an invisible rope, waiting for someone to join her in the darkness. Jocelyn is plagued by terrifying nightly visitations from a sinister entity, experiencing paralyzing fear and grotesque visions. After finding physical evidence of the creature, she consults a psychic who reveals it's an ancient being that feeds on fear. Equipped with protective charms, Jocelyn confronts and banishes the creature. Her nights become peaceful again, but she remains vigilant, knowing she has the strength to face any future darkness. A faint ray of light was still burning in the bedroom that evening before the deafening ringing in her ears began. There was a pit of silence in the room except for the subtle breeze that came in through an open window. The white lace drapes billowed ghostly, then returned to their original state. A dance to the song of crickets, a play illuminated by the moonlight. All a person needs for a good night's sleep. All of this would turn out to be a delusion. It had now become a habit to turn on the light shortly before going to sleep, even if she could not get any sleep these days. A soft whisper broke the silence. "We are coming for you." The soft voices bounced off the walls and reverberated like a hollow echo in her head. Did she really hear this, or was it just a dream? Suddenly, the voices erupted right in her ear. "We are coming for you." This time significantly more intense, which caused her to wake up abruptly. The room felt different, as if it was loaded with static energy. The ringing in her ears continued and disappeared in waves. Faint at first, like a slight hum in the distance, then welling up in a deafening and all-encompassing sound. When Jocelyn had a clear state of mind and really thought about it, she would always compare it to the sound of static on multiple televisions. Then she would imagine a room full of televisions stacked on top of each other, occupying the entire room up to the ceiling, with the light constantly shifting in a blur of black and white. Slowly, her consciousness returned to her and she felt goosebumps on her skin. Not the kind of goosebumps you got when you were cold, but the kind that alerted you in dire situations. A bodily response letting you know that you were not alone, and that in the worst-case scenario you might just have to make a run for it. It was a stage between sleeping and waking. Yet her consciousness was always on edge, so she could remember everything in detail afterward. It always started with the ringing, although sometimes she heard other sounds as well. Voices, as it seemed. Voices on a strange and different frequency, as if they were on a different channel. People talking over each other about everyday things that happened, and sometimes she seemed to recognize some of these voices. Occasionally, she would hear colleagues from her work in a buzz that was near inaudible, while other times she would hear her parents' familiar voices clear as day. Only she always knew for certain that they were not really her parents. There was something wrong with the sound and intonation of those voices, talking like they were unaware that they had Jocelyn's full attention, as if she were an outsider walking by on the street catching glimpses of the conversation. But often the voices that were unknown to her were well aware that someone was listening, and she was sure that this was exactly what they wanted. Slowly, the whispers swelled up until she caught a glimpse of the conversation. They were mocking voices with disgusting laughs, whose words had haunted her all along. "We are coming to get you." The feeling of certain doom came over her, that whoever hears these words or sees the ones who whisper them will find their end. But the question remained, how? She did not hear any voices this particular night though. This time there were footsteps. It sounded as if someone was dragging something heavy up the stairs at a slow pace until the footsteps came to an abrupt halt outside the door. The known tingle of goosebumps started from the toes. The unpleasant feeling slowly crept up her legs and up her spine, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The paralysis set in. "Go away." She heard her own voice shouting loud inside her head. The danger was lurking and she was not safe now. The delusion of the serene room was gone and was replaced with darkness. There were distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to move. She could not save herself even if she wanted to. This time it was too late, and there was nothing she could have done or changed about the situation or the order in which it happened. Not only were her muscles paralyzed, her vocal cords stopped working as well. She could not utter a word or sound. There was no one to help, and any attempt to scream for help had proved despondent. Her throat seemed to be closing anxiously. Much pain and effort were needed to take in even the smallest amount of air. The drops of sweat began to collect on her back before slowly trickling down her spine like little pearls. She broke out in a sweat of panic, as one would say. She wanted most of all to postpone the inevitable, that moment when she had to open her eyes. She wanted to postpone what she would have to be forced to see. The images were always different, and so was the sight of these shadows. Every night was like a different play that unfolded right in front of her. Disfigured faces that she could never let go, limbs contorted in impossible directions, hands closing around her throat while she had the feeling that something was sitting on her chest and was applying more and more pressure, a body crawling against hers under the covers. And when she woke up, she would discover that there was a small dent in the mattress in that specific spot. Still, she knew she could not avoid her own curiosity, and that curiosity always trumped the fear she felt inside, which later on she hated herself for. She cursed her own curiosity over and over again, but still that did not stop her from opening her eyes, not even once. Her heart began to beat louder as she feared it would burst out of her chest. That idea alone was enough for outright panic. It is strange how much a person could think in moments of misery and fear. It was pure adrenaline with the same choice time after time again, to freeze or run away. She could not utter a word, could not make a sound. There was no one to help, and now that choice had already been made for her. Someone else had chosen for her. Her body had given up without a chance to fight or run, to never look back. She had lost control over her own body. There was only one thing that somewhat worked. She could open or close her eyes. The fact that one day she would not wake up was something she was strangely sure of. A gut feeling she had deep down. The fear was irrepressible. She did what had to be done and opened her eyes, unsure, frightened. Her throat was being wrung like a wet towel as she started gasping for air. A shrill squeak escaped through her lungs over her pursed lips, a stiff, shivering stripe that seemed firmly glued. Tears streamed down her cheeks and got lost in her neck while she tasted the salt of them on her lips. She saw it happen in the reflection of the window opposite her bed. Then the door of the bedroom behind her slowly opened, and the creaking sound of the hinges was almost deafening. As the door opened wide, a stream of intense cold air suddenly blew in the room, and with it, the sudden stench of decomposition. The pungent smell quickly filled the bedroom, and the air seemed to feel denser and heavier while descending upon her. From the big and dark void in the doorway, she felt like she was being watched. Whatever was watching her from the darkness watched her for a while before slowly a shadow started stretching across the oak floor. The shadow stretched further and further as it crept over the walls from the floor and took the form of a tall, imposing figure. It seemed to continue moving through the walls, passing the mirror in which she could see the shape. Eventually, the shadow stopped behind the wall of her bed. Then from the doorway, a creature swiftly followed. 5 long bony fingers formed around the corner of the door, which were not human in shape or size. With its remarkably long razor-sharp nails, it clung tightly to the doorframe and left deep scratches in the wood. Those scratches would be immortalized there, and no one would ever know who or rather what had inflicted them. The creature started to crawl towards her bed. The motor skills were incoherent, and its body parts swayed and twisted. Hideous claws with which it dragged itself forward, that twisted thin body she heard crackling. And then suddenly it was gone as she just caught a glimpse of a foot disappearing under her bed. Something strange was happening this time. Everything was different from the previous visits of the shadows that besieged her. There were always several shadows, and while she had never seen this one before, she knew exactly who he was and what he came for. The shadows had announced his coming in various warnings and dreams. He was the one who had sent the others. He was the one needing madness, suffering, and fear to show himself in flesh and blood. King and ruler of his own legion in the underworld. The collector of damned souls. His emissaries did all the dirty work for him. This creature had never been human, never walked the earth. Its presence was clearly felt under her bed. Irregular breathing as if it was a faint, and it had never really learned to breathe before. Shortly after, a deep, unearthly growl followed, likening it to a rabid beast with its jaws wide open and waiting to ambush its prey. She was that prey. Nails scraping the wooden slats of her antique bed. It took a morbid pleasure out of her fear and despair and fed on it. Quickly, she closed her eyes again, hoping to keep them closed until the first shimmers of daylight came through the curtains again. Then she could banish this event like all the other times to a place in her own head. She could banish this event like all the other times to a place in her own head and pretend it never happened. She could convince herself it was just another nightmare, just another figment of her imagination. But this time felt different. This time, the presence was more real, more tangible, and she could feel its malevolence seeping into the very air she breathed. Jocelyn's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a deafening drum in the silence of her room. She could hear the creature moving beneath her bed, its claws scratching against the wood, its breath hot and fetid, like the air from a crypt. She squeezed her eyes shut tighter, willing herself to wake up, to escape this nightmare. But then she felt it. The bed shifted ever so slightly, the weight of the creature pressing down on the mattress. She could feel its presence growing closer, the air around her growing colder, more oppressive. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, trapped in her own bed, with nowhere to run. The creature's breath was now right next to her face, a sickening stench that made her stomach churn. She could feel its cold, bony fingers brush against her cheek, and she shuddered in terror. She wanted to open her eyes, to confront whatever horror awaited her, but she couldn't. She was frozen in fear, unable to move, unable to even breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence was gone. The weight lifted from the bed, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling vanished. Jocelyn lay there, trembling, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't dare open her eyes, not yet. She needed to be sure it was really gone. After what felt like an eternity, she finally opened her eyes. The room was empty, just as it had been before. The curtains billowed softly in the breeze, the moonlight casting a gentle glow over the room. But something was different. The scratches on the doorframe were still there, deep gouges in the wood. And on the floor, next to her bed, was a small pool of black, viscous liquid, like tar. Jocelyn's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream. But the evidence was right in front of her. The scratches, the liquid, the lingering stench of decay. She had to do something. She couldn't go on living like this, haunted by shadows and creatures that tormented her every night. The next morning, Jocelyn decided to take action. She couldn't live in fear any longer. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She started by researching sleep paralysis, hoping to find some explanation for the terrifying experiences she had been having. But the more she read, the less convinced she became that it was simply a case of sleep paralysis. The shadows, the voices, the creature, none of it fit the usual descriptions. She decided to visit a local psychic, hoping they could provide some insight into the strange occurrences. The psychic's shop was a small, dimly lit room filled with the smell of incense and the sound of wind chimes. The walls were lined with shelves filled with crystals, tarot cards, and other mystical paraphernalia. The psychic, a middle-aged woman with long silver hair and piercing blue eyes, listened intently as Jocelyn described her experiences. She nodded thoughtfully, her expression serious. When Jocelyn finished, the psychic closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "You are being visited by something very old and very powerful," she said finally. "It is not a ghost, nor is it a demon. It is something else entirely, something that exists in the spaces between our world and the next. It feeds on fear and despair, and it has chosen you as its target." Jocelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "What can I do to stop it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The psychic opened her eyes and looked at Jocelyn with a mixture of pity and determination. "You must confront it," she said. "You must face your fear and banish it from your life. It will not be easy, and it will not be without danger. But it is the only way to free yourself from its grip." That night, Jocelyn prepared herself for the confrontation. She armed herself with every protective charm and talisman the psychic had given her, and she steeled her nerves for what was to come. She knew she couldn't run from this any longer. She had to face the creature head-on and banish it from her life once and for all. As the night wore on, the familiar feeling of dread began to creep over her. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened, and the ringing in her ears started again. She felt the paralysis setting in, but this time she fought against it with all her might. She forced herself to stay awake, to stay alert. The footsteps began again, dragging up the stairs, stopping outside her door. The door creaked open, and the cold air and stench of decay filled the room. Jocelyn's heart raced, but she didn't close her eyes. She couldn't afford to. She had to confront whatever was coming. The shadow appeared again, stretching across the floor and walls, followed by the creature itself. It crawled into the room, its limbs twisting and contorting, its claws scraping against the floor. Jocelyn watched in horror as it approached her bed, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. This was her only chance. The creature stopped at the foot of her bed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Jocelyn took a deep breath and spoke the words the psychic had taught her. "I banish you from this place. You have no power over me. Leave now and never return." The creature snarled, its eyes blazing with fury. It lunged at her, but Jocelyn held her ground. She repeated the words, louder and more forcefully. "I banish you from this place. You have no power over me. Leave now and never return." The creature let out a deafening roar, and for a moment, Jocelyn thought it would tear her apart. But then, slowly, it began to fade. The shadows receded, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The creature let out one final, enraged howl before disappearing completely. Jocelyn collapsed onto her bed, exhausted but victorious. She had faced her fear and banished the creature from her life. She knew it wasn't over. It would always be lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. But she also knew that she had the strength to confront it, to fight it, and to win. In the weeks that followed, Jocelyn's life began to return to normal. The shadows no longer haunted her nights, and the voices no longer whispered in her ear. She slept peacefully for the first time in months, free from the fear that had gripped her for so long. As she lay in bed one night, staring at the moonlit ceiling, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The shadows might always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind. But she was no longer afraid. She had faced the darkness and won. And she would continue to fight, no matter what came her way. Today, we are going to discuss the story of the curse of Kuli Kup Shahi House, and group of friends went there. In the heart of Hyderabad, nestled between the narrow lanes of the old city, stood a decrepit mansion known as the Kuli Kup Shahi House. Abandoned for decades, the mansion bore witness to a dark and mysterious past that whispered through its crumbling walls. The structure, once grand and opulent, was now a shadow of its former self, with ivy crawling up its sides and windows shattered like broken dreams. Rumors of a curse surrounded the mansion, and locals spoke of eerie lights flickering in its broken windows at night. Ghost stories were shared in hushed tones, warning of a malevolent spirit bound to the house. Despite the warnings, a group of adventurous friends, Arav, Mira, Rohan, and Priya, decided to explore the haunted Kuli Kup Shahi House on a moonless night. Their curiosity was piqued by the tales, and they saw the exploration as a test of bravery. As they stepped into the mansion's creaking entrance, the air grew thick with an oppressive silence. The friends, armed with flashlights and nerves of steel, navigated through the dusty corridors and dilapidated rooms. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the once opulent interiors now echoed with the haunting footsteps of the past. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly veils, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. In one room, they discovered an old portrait covered in a tattered cloth. With trepidation, they unveiled the painting, revealing the stern face of a man with piercing eyes. The painting was finely detailed, capturing the man's austere expression and commanding presence. A sudden chill swept through the room as they noticed a striking resemblance between the man in the portrait and Rowan. The eerie similarity sent shivers down their spines, and unease settled among the group. As they continued their exploration, strange whispers seemed to drift from the shadows, and ghostly apparitions danced at the edge of their vision. The air became stifling, and each step felt like a descent into an abyss of malevolence. The mansion's atmosphere grew more oppressive, with walls that seemed to close in and floors that seemed to extend endlessly into darkness. Their flashlights flickered, casting unsettling shadows that played tricks on their eyes. Venturing deeper, they stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the mansion. A secret door, cleverly disguised as part of the wall, creaked open to reveal a steep staircase leading down. In the center of the room lay an ancient, dusty book on a stone pedestal. The book's cover was bound in weathered leather, with strange symbols etched into its surface. Intrigued, they opened it, revealing cryptic symbols and ominous writings that spoke of a curse that bound the mansion to a tormented soul. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. The friends realized they were not alone. The ghostly figure of the man from the portrait materialized before them, his eyes burning with a vengeful fire. He wore the same stern expression, but now it was twisted with rage and sorrow. The curse, it seemed, had awakened, seeking retribution for sins long buried. Panic set in as the friends scrambled to escape the malevolent presence. But the mansion seemed to come alive, its walls closing in on them, trapping them in a nightmarish maze. Doors that had once led to familiar rooms now opened into dark, unknown passages. The friends' frantic footsteps echoed through the halls, blending with their terrified screams. Desperation consumed them as they fought against an unseen force, their voices calling out in vain. In the end, the coolly-equipped Shahi house claimed its victims, their cries silenced by the heavy gloom of the mansion. The walls, now stained with their fear, seemed to absorb their essence, adding to the cursed legacy of the house. The story of their disappearance would become another chapter in the mansion's dark history, a warning to others who might dare to enter. The cursed legacy continued to linger in the shadows of Hyderabad, a constant reminder to heed the ominous tales of the past. The mansion stood as a silent sentinel, its haunted halls whispering secrets and its windows flickering with eerie lights, waiting for the next curious souls to step inside and face the wrath of the tormented spirit bound within. At the end of the old, winding road past Colin's house lies a field dotted with ancient fruit trees, their gnarled branches stretching towards the sky. Once a small, dilapidated house stood there, its windows clouded with grime, where a solitary man named Davis resided. Davis was a reclusive figure, living off an unknown source of income, seldom interacting with the villagers except on market days. His presence in the town was an enigma, and the mystery only deepened when a pale, thin young man began accompanying him back from the market one fateful day. This young man, whose name no one knew, moved into Davis's home and became a constant, silent shadow. Their relationship was a puzzle to the villagers, who speculated endlessly about the nature of their bond. Some whispered that Davis was a teacher, others that the young man was a distant relative. But as the two were often seen wandering together in the hills and woods, their heads bent in secretive conversation, darker rumors began to take hold. The villagers suspected them of practicing forbidden magic and plotting unspeakable deeds. Once a month, under the light of the full moon, Davis and his young companion would venture to a desolate hilltop, scattered with ancient stones and overgrown with weeds. There they would stay until dawn, performing rituals that no one dared to witness. One curious soul, braver than most, asked Davis why they frequented such a remote, eerie place in the dead of night. "I love old places," Davis replied with a thin smile. "They remind me of the past. The air is beautiful on a summer's night, and the moonlight reveals the countryside in a way the sun never could. The young man interrupted, his tone sharp and defensive. We don't want other people near us. We just want to talk to each other. Davis's smile faltered, and he added, there are tales of bodies buried beneath those stones, soldiers from long ago. Farmers sometimes unearth bones and ancient relics in the fields. I wish to learn more about their lives and their gods. I believe they practice powerful magic. One September morning, as dawn struggled to break through a thick fog, a farm worker trudged up the hill to the woods. Through the mist, he saw a shape hanging from a tree. As he approached, his heart pounded in his chest. It was the young man, lifeless, swinging gently from a noose, a bloodied knife lying at his feet. Terrified, the farm worker fled back to the village, rousing the inhabitants with his frantic cries. A group of men, grim-faced and armed with a horse, returned to the hill. When they cut down the body, they were shocked to see the young man dressed in black garments, reminiscent of ancient clerical robes. As they placed his body across the horse's back, the animal whinnied in terror, sensing the unnatural presence. The horse's fear intensified as they neared the village, and it eventually bucked, causing the body to tumble to the ground. As the men approached Davis's house, they were met by a young boy, pale and trembling, surrounded by concerned women. He had been sent ahead to check on Davis, and what he had seen rendered him mute with shock. Ignoring the horse's renewed panic, the men forced their way into the house. In the kitchen, a horrific sight greeted them. Davis lay on the table, his eyes covered with a black handkerchief, his hands bound behind his back, and his chest grotesquely split open, his heart missing. The stench of death was overwhelming, driving the men back outside to gulp fresh air. When they returned, they placed the young man's body next to Davis's and began a thorough search of the house. In a cupboard, they'd found a small green bottle containing a potent sleeping draught. Looks like the young man drugged Davis and then murdered him, one of the men suggested, examining the bottle. Maybe he needed Davis's heart for some dark magic. Then, filled with remorse, he took his own life. The villagers, appalled by the grisly events, decided that neither Davis nor his companion deserved to be buried in consecrated ground. They never came to church and dabbled in unholy practices, they declared. 12 men wrapped the bodies in black shrouds and carried them to a desolate spot outside the village. There, they dug a deep pit, threw the corpses in, and covered them with heavy stones. Even today, horses shy away from that cursed ground, and a strange, flickering light is said to emanate from the burial site on moonlit nights. Sometime later, travelers discovered a pool of blood on the road near Davis's former home. Fat black flies swarmed over the blood, feasting. A man fetched water to wash it away, but as the blood was cleaned, the flies rose in a thick, dark cloud and drifted towards the burnt ruins of Davis's house. The villagers, determined to rid themselves of the lingering evil, set fire to the house. It burned to the ground, yet for years afterward, people reported seeing the spectral figures of Davis and the young man standing on the road under the full moon. Years passed, and the story of Davis and his young companion faded into local legend. But the land where their house once stood remained untouched. Farmers avoided it, and children dared each other to venture near, though few were brave enough. On certain nights, when the moon was high and the wind howled through the trees, a sense of dread would settle over the village, and the old tales would be whispered anew. In the present day, a young historian named Emily, fascinated by local folklore, arrived in the village. She had heard the chilling tales of Davis and his companion, and was determined to uncover the truth. Armed with old records and a relentless curiosity, she began her investigation. Emily's research led her to the ancient hilltop where Davis and the young man had conducted their mysterious rituals. She spent countless nights there, braving the eerie silence and the spectral light that occasionally flickered among the stones. She discovered ancient carvings and symbols hinting at long-forgotten rites and deities. One night, as Emily was poring over her notes by lantern light, she felt a presence. Turning, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the circle of stones. Heart-pounding, she approached cautiously. The figure resolved into the spectral form of the young man, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret. "Why are you here?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The ghostly figure pointed towards the ground, where the carvings were most intricate. "We sought to unlock the secrets of the past," he said, his voice a faint echo. "But we were punished for our hubris. Beware, for some knowledge is meant to remain hidden." Determined to lay the spirits to rest, Emily continued her research, uncovering more about the rituals Davis and his companion had practiced. She found references to an ancient rite involving the heart of a willing sacrifice intended to gain forbidden knowledge and power. With the help of the village's elders, she performed a cleansing ritual at the hilltop, seeking to undo the dark magic that had been wrought there. As she chanted the ancient words, the air grew cold, and a fierce wind whipped around her. The spectral figures of Davis and the young man appeared, their forms flickering like candle flames. "We are sorry," the young man whispered, tears streaming down his ethereal face. "We did not understand the cost." In a final act of redemption, Davis and the young man merged with the swirling wind, dissipating into the night. The oppressive sense of dread lifted, and the hilltop felt peaceful for the first time in centuries. With the spirits finally at rest, the village began to heal. The land where Davis's house once stood was left undisturbed, a silent monument to the dangers of meddling with the unknown. Emily, though deeply affected by her experience, continued her work, sharing the lessons she had learned. The story. In the fading light of a September evening in 1811, a young boy arrived at the grand entrance of Eswaby Hall, nestled deep within the desolate moors of Lincolnshire. The towering, austere 18th century house loomed above him, its windows glinting ominously in the twilight. As he rang the bell, the echoes seemed to resonate with an otherworldly vibrancy, blending with the whispers of the encroaching night. Before him, a vast park stretched, filled with gnarled trees that seemed to whisper secrets of their own, while a lonely church stood nearby, its ancient clock ticking ominously. Stephen Elliott, orphaned and alone, was there at the behest of his reclusive cousin, Mr. Abney. The townsfolk, who had always seen Mr. Abney as a man more enamored with ancient tomes and esoteric studies than with human company, were surprised by his offer to house the boy. As the door creaked open, Mr. Abney's eyes gleamed with a strange mix of eagerness and curiosity. "How old are you, my boy? How are you?" Mr. Abney's questions flowed with an almost unnerving repetition. "How old are you?" "I'm 12 years old next birthday," replied Stephen, his voice steady despite his inner trepidation. "Good, good," muttered Mr. Abney, his smile widening unnaturally. "The 11th of September, yes? Excellent. I must write this down in my book. Are you sure you will be 12? "Yes, sir, quite sure," Stephen affirmed. "Parks, take him to Mrs. Bunch's room," Mr. Abney directed his servant. "Let him have his supper." Mrs. Bunch, the housekeeper, was a beacon of warmth in the otherwise cold and foreboding mansion. She welcomed Stephen with open arms, sharing stories and snippets of knowledge about Eswaby Hall and its surroundings. Stephen felt an immediate bond with her, finding solace in her presence. As Stephen settled into his new home, he began to explore the sprawling estate. One November evening, as he sat by the fire in Mrs. Bunch's room, a question gnawed at him. "Is Mr. Abney a good man?" he asked suddenly. Mrs. Bunch's reaction was immediate. "Good, my child? He's the kindest man I've ever known. Haven't I told you about the little boy he brought here 7 years ago, and the little girl 2 years later?" Stephen's curiosity was piqued. "No, please tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch." "The little girl," Mrs. Bunch began, her voice tinged with melancholy, "was found wandering the streets. Mr. Abney took her in, but she vanished one morning without a trace. As for the boy, he came here one winter, a street musician. Mr. Abney questioned him, took him in, but he too disappeared. That night, Stephen was plagued by a nightmare. In his dream, he stood before an old, unused bathroom near his bedroom. Through the glass-topped door, he saw a thin, dusty body in the bath, its hands pressed over its heart, a sad smile on its lips. As he watched, the body let out a terrible cry, its arms moving as if in agony. Stephen awoke, his heart pounding, to find himself standing before the same bathroom door. Bravely, he peered through the glass again, but the apparition was gone. Mrs. Bunch and Mr. Abney were both intrigued by Stephen's dream. Mrs. Bunch covered the glass door with a curtain, while Mr. Abney made meticulous notes in his ever-present book. As winter gave way to spring, 2 more unsettling incidents occurred. One morning, Mrs. Bunch reprimanded Stephen for tearing his night shirt. Examining the garment, Stephen saw long, jagged cuts, eerily similar to scratches on his bedroom door. "How did you manage to tear your nightshirt so badly?" Mrs. Bunch asked, her tone a mix of irritation and concern. "I don't remember how it happened," Stephen replied, equally puzzled. "But they're just like the scratches on my door." Mrs. Bunch's face paled. "Strange indeed. Too high for any animal. Lock your door tonight, Stephen." "I always do," Stephen assured her. The next evening, Mr. Parks, the usually composed servant, appeared in Mrs. Bunch's room, visibly shaken. "Mr. Abney will have to get his own wine if he wants a drink," he muttered. "There's something strange under the house, noises like whispers or something worse." Mrs. Bunch tried to calm him. "You'll frighten young Stephen with such talk." But Stephen was already filled with dread, sensing that March 24, 1812 was a day marked by a fierce, howling wind that seemed to carry the voices of the dead. After lunch, Mr. Abney summoned Stephen to his library at 11 o'clock that night, promising to reveal something about his future. Excited and nervous, Stephen agreed, though he was warned not to tell anyone. As night fell, Stephen peered out of his bedroom window, the full moon casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Strange cries echoed through the night, growing louder until they seemed to come from just beneath his window. He saw two children, a boy and a girl, standing under the trees. The girl resembled the one from his dream, her hands over her heart, smiling sadly. The boy's appearance filled him with terror. His eyes were hollow, his nails long and dirty, and a gaping black hole marred his chest. The children's mournful cries echoed as they vanished into the darkness. Despite his fear, Stephen knew he had to meet Mr. Abney. The library door was ajar, but when he tried to open it, it resisted. He'd heard Mr. Abney's voice, filled with fear and pain, then silence. The door swung open, revealing Mr. Abney slumped in his chair, eyes wide with terror, a gaping hole in his chest where his heart should have been. An old book lay open on the table, detailing a dark ritual requiring the hearts of 3 young people to grant the practitioner power. Mr. Abney had already taken 2 hearts, and Stephen was to be the 3rd. Stephen fled the room, leaving the horrific scene behind. In the years that followed, rumors about Mr. Abney's death circulated, but Stephen knew the truth. The ghosts of the children had returned to claim their vengeance, and the dark secrets of Aswarby Hall would haunt him forever. Years later, Stephen, now an adult, found himself unable to escape the shadows of Aswarby Hall. The events of that night remained etched in his memory, the cries of the ghostly children echoing in his mind. He returned to the hall, determined to uncover the truth behind his cousin's dark practices and to put the spirits of the children to rest. As he delved into Mr. Abney's journals and books, he discovered a pattern of disappearances spanning decades, each coinciding with the same date, March 24. Each entry detailed the gruesome ritual, the sacrifices made to attain forbidden knowledge and power. The more he read, the more he realized the extent of his cousin's depravity. One stormy night, Stephen ventured into the wine cellar, the place where the bodies were supposedly hidden. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. He stumbled upon a hidden door, concealed behind stacks of old wine barrels. With trembling hands, he pried it open, revealing a narrow passage leading into the darkness. The passageway led to a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center, he found a makeshift altar stained with old blood. Around it, the skeletal remains of children lay scattered, their bones twisted in eternal agony. Among them, he recognized the little girl and the boy from his visions. Stephen's heart ached with sorrow and guilt. He knew he had to do something to free their tormented souls. He gathered the remains and, with great care, carried them to the churchyard. Under the watchful eyes of the ancient church, he buried the bones, offering a prayer for their peace. As he stood over the graves, a cold wind swept through the churchyard, and the ghostly figures of the children appeared before him. Their expressions were no longer filled with sorrow, but with gratitude. They whispered their thanks before fading into the night, leaving Stephen with a sense of relief and closure. However, his peace was short-lived. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt a chilling presence in his room. The temperature dropped, and an oppressive silence filled the air. The specter of Mr. Abney materialized, his eyes burning with hatred and fury. "You cannot escape me, Stephen," the ghost hissed. You have meddled with forces beyond your understanding. The ritual must be completed." Stephen stood his ground, his resolve strengthened by the memory of the children he had laid to rest. "Your time is over, Apney. You will never harm another soul." With a surge of determination, Stephen reached for the silver cup that had once held the sacrificial wine. He recited the incantation he had found in Mr. Apney's journal, hoping to sever the bond between his cousin's malevolent spirit and the mortal realm. As he spoke the ancient words, the room seemed to tremble, and the ghost of Mr. Apney writhed in agony. The walls echoed with the tormented screams of the children whose lives he had stolen. The specter's form flickered, growing weaker with each word of the incantation. "You think you can defeat me, boy?" Apney's voice echoed, filled with malice and desperation. "I am eternal." But Stephen's resolve did not waver. He continued the incantation, the words flowing with newfound strength and conviction. The ghost's presence grew fainter, its hold on the physical world weakening. With a final, earth-shaking roar, the spirit of Mr. Apney dissipated into the darkness, leaving behind an eerie silence. The oppressive cold lifted, and the room returned to normal. Stephen collapsed to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. He had broken the cycle of evil that had plagued Aswarby Hall for decades. In the following days, the atmosphere in Aswarby Hall transformed. The oppressive, malevolent energy that had permeated its halls dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm and peace. Stephen continued to explore the mansion, uncovering more of Mr. Apney's dark secrets and ensuring that they would never be used again. He found hidden passages and secret chambers, each filled with remnants of his cousin's twisted experiments and arcane rituals. Carefully, he destroyed the cursed artifacts and burned the malevolent tomes, ensuring that the knowledge contained within could never harm another soul. Mrs. Bunch and Mr. Parks, unaware of the true nature of the horrors that had transpired, noticed the change in Stephen. They saw a young man who had faced unimaginable terrors and emerged stronger for it. With their support, Stephen began to rebuild his life, dedicating himself to restoring the mansion to a place of light and hope. Spring arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal and rebirth. The once foreboding Aswarby Hall now stood as a symbol of resilience and redemption. Stephen, now a young man of 20, decided to open the mansion's doors to the community, transforming it into a sanctuary for those in need. Under his guidance, Aswarby Hall became a place of learning and refuge, where children without families could find solace and education. The ghosts of the past no longer haunted its halls. Instead, laughter and joy filled the air. Stephen often visited the graves of the children he had laid to rest, paying his respects and thanking them for their guidance and protection. He knew that without their intervention, he would have fallen victim to the same fate as those who came before him. As the years passed, Stephen's reputation grew, and the story of Aswarby Hall became one of legend. People spoke of the young boy who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, transforming a place of evil into a beacon of hope. Stephen never forgot the lessons he had learned or the sacrifices that had been made. He continued to honor the memory of the children and his own journey, ensuring that the legacy of Aswarby Hall was one of compassion, courage, and redemption. In the end, Stephen found peace in knowing that he had not only freed himself from the clutches of his cousin's malevolence, but had also created a haven for future generations. Aswarby Hall, once a place of fear and despair, stood as a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience, a legacy that would live on for centuries to come.